Present us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favour, and further us with thy continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally, by thy mercy, attain everlasting life. Amen. Introduction of guests. Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you to this Assembly, it's my pleasure to introduce some guests in your gallery, Mr. Speaker, in the Speaker's Gallery from the Saskatchewan Dental Hygienists Association. Mr. Speaker, we have Alyssa Boyer, Shelby Ham, Chris Gordon, Catherine Fokerson, and Carly Emerson with us now. They'll have some more guests joining us later, Mr. Speaker. They're here today for a number of meetings and to host a MLA reception for both sides of the House later this afternoon. We look forward to seeing them there, and I would ask all members to please give them a warm welcome to their Legislative Assembly.
Recognize a member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to join in with the Minister in welcoming the group of dental hygienists that are here today. We look forward to hearing a little bit more about life in your world at the reception later on today, and want to thank you for the hard work that you're doing every day. And I know that I have a very good relationship with my dental hygienist, as we all should. And I would ask all members to join me in welcoming these folks to their assembly.
Recognize a member for Kelvington Wadena.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a great pleasure for me to rise in the House today and welcome 16 grade 8 students from the great community of Wadena. And they are accompanied by their teacher, Angela Fielding, and educational assistant, Ona Murius. Please join me in welcoming them to their Legislative Assembly.
Recognize a member for John Lakeview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is my great pleasure to welcome a number of guests seated in the East Gallery. With us today, we have a group of 29 grade 6 and grade 7 students from Lakeview School, right in the center of Regina Lakeview. I suspect they probably walked over today in a nice fall-like day, Mr. Speaker. And with them is their teacher, Mr. Jared Clark. Not only a teacher, he's a biologist and a birder and a parent and a farmer, and really an enthusiastic and dedicated educator. And he takes every opportunity to bring his students over to their Legislative Assembly to engage in the process here. So I want to welcome them, Mr. Speaker, welcome each of these young students, and thank them for coming to view goings-on at their Legislative Assembly. Thank you.
Recognize the Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is indeed a pleasure for me to introduce a couple that's with us today, my oldest daughter and her husband, Crystal and Rusty Bukowski. Rusty's home right now. He works in Nunavut, so he is in Saskatchewan and then, of course, in Nunavut at the workplace. And Crystal was raised, all three of my daughters were raised with a political mother. They were quite young when I first got elected, so they have been my great support throughout my political career, and it's truly a pleasure to have Crystal and Rusty in the gallery. Please join me in welcoming them.
Recognize the member for John Rosemont.
Requesting leave for a really long introduction.
Well, this is an exciting day for the legislature. Members asked leave for an extended introduction. Leave granted. Recognize the member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you, it's an honor to welcome someone seated in your gallery. That's Sean Weimer. Sean is the Executive Director of the Queen City Marathon, the GMS QCM. He's also the Executive Director of Run Regina, which basically is the umbrella organization for runs like the Run Regina First Responders Run, which will be held on June 7th this year, the Run Regina Canada Day Fun Run, on Canada Day. And of course the QCM, they're involved as well with the park run that occurs every Saturday at 9 a.m. In Wascana Park. They had over 7,000 runners involved in the runs last year and just brings so much to our city and our community. I ask all members to welcome Sean Weimer to his assembly.
Yeah, I was going. No, we'll let that one go. That's pretty good. Presenting petitions. I recognize the member from Cypress Hills.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to present a petition from the citizens who are opposed to the federal government tax decision to impose an unfair and ineffective carbon tax on the province of Saskatchewan. I'd like to read the prayer. We in the prayer reads as follows. Respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan take the following action to cause the government of Saskatchewan to take the necessary steps to stop the federal government from imposing a carbon tax on the province. Mr. Speaker, this petition is signed by the good citizens of North Battleford, Unity, and Riddell. I do submit.
Hear, hear. Reading and receiving petitions. Statements by members. Recognize the member for Kenora Pelly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Saturday, November 24th, we will commemorate the 86th anniversary of Holodomor famine, genocide of 1932-1933. Mr. Speaker, during the Holodomor, the Soviet regime killed millions of Ukrainians by starving them of their agriculture products. Stalin declared food to be illegal for Ukrainian farmers, and Soviet troops confiscated grain and livestock. Farmers found to be hiding the grain were shot on sight. The Soviets blocked villages from receiving food to ensure the people suffered. People ate grass, tree bark, and anything to keep themselves from starving. The word Holodomor literally translated from Ukrainian meaning death by hunger. Mr. Speaker, Canada has very strong ties to Ukraine, having the third highest Ukrainian population in the world. Holodomor has only been recognized as an act of genocide by 16 countries, Canada being one. Mr. Speaker, we condemn these crimes and pray for the day that Ukrainians can live in peace. But for now, we will continue to remember the Holodomor and the millions of Ukrainians that we have lost. Never, ever again. Wieczny pamięć. Spasiba, Pan Speaker.
Recognize the member for Athabasca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to celebrate the Beardy's Blackhawks midget AA and AAA hockey teams, who along with the Notre Dame Argos will play their final game this season. The Blackhawks have seen no shortage of success on the ice, with the AAA team winning the 2001 League Championship and the Air Canada Cup Western Regional Champion. Blackhawks alumni include NHLers DJ King and Lyndon Vey, as well as a two-time Stanley Cup champion, Dwight King. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Blackhawks wasn't just a hockey team. It was the heart of this community, of our community. The AAA Blackhawks are the only hockey team in Canada that is located on and operated by First Nations, the Beardies and Okomasas Cree Nation. When describing the team, Blackhawks Minor Hockey Association spokesperson Rick Gamble told the Star Phoenix, "The Beardies Blackhawks, we represent the First Nations of this province, and a lot of these First Nations kids would never get a chance to play anywhere else," end quote. We share in this community's profound disappointment, along with GM and former Prince Albert Raider Mel Peranto. Disappointment that the young men from this First Nations and area won't be able to compete for the Blackhawks after this year. We do want to acknowledge and congratulate all the players, coaches, volunteers, and parents who have made this team so special. We support the continued fight to have the Beardies Okomasas Blackhawks reinstated. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Regina University.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I rise to highlight a gentleman who exemplifies the best of Regina and someone I consider a friend. Mr. Speaker, John Hopkins, the CEO of Regina Chamber of Commerce, was named the 2019 Red Cross Humanitarian of the Year. John received his award at the Power of Humanity Awards reception in Regina on November the 8th. He received this honour for his dedication to helping others. As members may know, in June of 2018, John was diagnosed with advanced prostate cancer. And in true John fashion, he used the scary diagnosis to spread awareness about prostate cancer and help other men understand the importance of regular physical exams. He's also been a champion of reconciliation. He's a founding member of Reconciliation Regina and organizes the annual Sludge Walk in North Central Regina. He's also a strong advocate for recovery programs. On a personal note, I can say he is a strong champion for women as well. We know and love him as a very powerful voice for the province we all love, and most certainly for the city of Regina. Mr. Speaker, in November of 2018, he underwent his last chemo treatment and is looking forward to spending time with his family watching the beloved Leafs. Have a great Regina Day, John, and thank you for being you.
As a member for Regina Rosemont.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to celebrate the GMS Queen City Marathon, which was held the weekend of September 6th this year. The QCM is a remarkable community undertaking with hundreds of volunteers. It's truly a sight to behold, with more than 6,000 participants hitting the streets and paths with runners from all over, 200 different Saskatchewan communities, 8 other provinces or territories, 13 U.S. states, and 4 additional countries. This event is a boon to our local economy. The QCM is a qualifying race for the Boston Marathon, but many run one of their other races, as the QCM features half marathons, 5 and 10K races, relays, walks, and youth mini marathons. I ran the half marathon once again this year, as did the member for Regina Elphinstone Centre. We have had the sore legs to prove it. My son William ran the mini marathon. It was another incredible race weekend, and of course it raised thousands of dollars for valued charities. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask all members to join me in thanking all those that made the 2019 QCM such an incredible success, including race director Sean Weimer, the board and its chair Doug Leask, the main sponsor GMS and all other sponsors, the legions of volunteers and fans, and of course to congratulate all participants. Thanks, Mr. Speaker.
As a member of Carrot River Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This summer, Carrot River hosted the KCRA Outback Rodeo. The weekend began with flavors of the Outback and a cruise night held at Carrot River Town Square. Over 300 competitors entertained the weekend crowds with events like saddle bronc riding, steer riding, team roping, steer wrestling, and breakaway roping. Spectators were also treated to the mini broncs and wild ponies. Mr. Speaker, the Carrot River Outback drill team impressed attendees with their precision performance. And those looking for a break from rodeo activities found it at the Artisans and Craftsmen Trade Show, climbing wall, food booth, and beer gardens. Saturday night was a cabaret, and everyone was given the chance to kick up their boots on the dance floor. Carrot River's own Final Warning treated the dancers to live music well into the morning. Mr. Speaker, Gloria's food truck was also on hand for those who worked up an appetite on the dance floor. Sunday morning, there was a pancake breakfast and more rodeo activities to entertain the crowd. I even ended up in the dunk tank, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when the final event was completed on Sunday evening, over 1,000 spectators had enjoyed the rodeo weekend. Please join me in congratulating the KCRA Outback Rodeo organizers on another hugely successful event. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Again, as a member for Moose Jaw, Waccamaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This past Saturday, over 392 people took in the 28th annual Moose Jaw Festival of Trees in support of the Moose Jaw Health Foundation. This year's fundraiser was to support a new state-of-the-art digital mammography machine for the F.H. Wigmore Regional Hospital. The Moose Jaw Festival of Trees has become one of the largest and most popular fundraising events in the city. And through its 28 years, over $4.3 million has been raised for the Health Foundation. This year's festival was hosted at the Moose Jaw Ford Curling Centre because there were over 300 attendees for the auction and the organizers had to find a larger venue. Beyond the impressive design and atmosphere, supporters were served to a special dinner prepared by Top Chef Canada winner Dale McKay. And then there was the highlight of the night, the grand live and silent auctions. The beautifully decorated trees and various displays were auctioned off with numerous silent auction items. Mr. Speaker, after all the donations were tallied, over $372,000 was raised Saturday night for a new mammography unit. Please join me in congratulating the Moose Jaw Festival of Trees organizers and all of the tree designers on yet another successful year. Thank you.
Recognize the member for Melfort.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor for me to stand to my feet today to honor a friend. On September 6th of this year, Dr. Yemi Laujbakan received the G. William N. Fitzgerald Award for Excellence in Surgery. We all knew he was an amazing surgeon, Mr. Speaker, and we're not surprised that the Canadian Association of General Surgeons agrees. But, Mr. Speaker, Dr. Yemi is so much more than just a great surgeon. When God brought Dr. Yemi, his wife Faluka, and their two boys, Peter and Daniel, to our community, he sent life with them. Dr. Yemi's been a friend and a brother to me, and he's taught me many things over these last 12 years since I moved home. Mr. Speaker, I've spent many late nights up praying with Dr. Yemi, and he taught me what it is to love and to serve the people of your hometown and the people of your new nation. Dr. Yemi and his wife and their kids, like so many of others in this province, they left their nation behind, their families. He's since buried his mother. But they leave their families behind and they come and serve our community. So, Mr. Speaker, the northeast part of Saskatchewan, we needed a surgeon, and Dr. Yemi answered the call. We appreciate him, we appreciate his family and all that he's done for us. So I'm just so privileged to be able to stand before this House today and on behalf of all the people of the Northeast, to honor our friend and our brother, Dr. Yemi Laujbakan. Thank you so much.
If the member for Carrot River Valley could let us know the next time there's a dunk tank, that would be awesome. Question period. Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Everywhere I go in Saskatchewan, I hear from frontline workers who are deeply concerned about dangerous choices made by this government. They want the public to really know what's happening in healthcare, in social services, in education, but they're afraid to tell their story, scared of retribution from a vindictive government desperate to hide from their failures. Now, Mr. Speaker, in healthcare in particular, that fear, that culture of secrecy has nurses and doctors too afraid to speak out about what's really going on in our hospitals. Today, we're releasing a Saskatchewan Health Authority memo that further reveals this government's allergy to transparency, Mr. Speaker. A memo that sends physicians and others the clear message that challenging the SHA talking points is unacceptable. We know there are problems in our hospitals, Mr. Speaker. To the Premier, why is the SHA sending memos telling frontline staff to be silent about their concerns?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, another secret memo, Mr. Speaker, like the ones last week that are widely distributed to staff everywhere. Mr. Speaker, I don't even know what memo the member opposite is talking about. No direction has come from my office or from this government to muzzle anyone. Mr. Speaker, if he'd like to either table the memo or explain what he's talking about, I'd be pleased to answer.
Good answer.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, this memo criticized physician leaders who have communicated directly with external agencies. External agencies like the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. And it goes on to say that this external communication has led to, and I quote, discordant messaging. Discordant messaging. There's some newspeak for you, Mr. Speaker. That's code. That's code for don't tell the public the truth about the real problems in our emergency rooms, our wards, our long-term care homes. Doctors are obliged to advocate for their patients. It's our professional duty, and the public has a right to know the truth. To the Premier, will he make it clear to healthcare workers that they're not just permitted, but encouraged to advocate on behalf of their patients, to fight for the resources they need to do their job? Or does he stand behind this memo telling them to be silent about their concerns?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, neither the Premier or I have even seen the memo that he's talking about. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to take that under advisement based on some of the so-called top-secret earth-shaking memos that they've released in the past, Mr. Speaker. I don't know what that memo says, but, Mr. Speaker, it wasn't as a directive from myself or from the Premier. Mr. Speaker, when senior managers at the SHA, obviously there's many memos that are flowing between senior managers to different people. In no way would this government ever muzzle frontline workers. Would we ever muzzle doctors, Mr. Speaker? For that member who is a doctor, who should know better, Mr. Speaker, in no way would we do that, and he should know better.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and the Premier should know that this is exactly what's going on across this province, that my colleagues, others in healthcare, others in education and social services are getting exactly this kind of message all the time. Watch what you say, or be careful, you might not have a job anymore. That's the message that we hear across this province, Mr. Speaker. Absolutely. And you know,
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition. Please come to order, everyone.
Mr. Speaker, we saw this summer an example of the government trying to take it to a new level as they tried to introduce a snitch line so that people could report on frontline healthcare workers if they didn't care for what they saw. The problems in our emergency rooms are not the fault of the hardworking staff that are treating patients overburdened, underpaid, understaffed in our overcrowded emergency rooms. Mr. Speaker, the crisis in our ERs isn't their fault. It's this government's fault. Mr. Speaker, will the Premier apologize to the staff who feel that their every move is under the microscope and are being told that they have to be silent about what this government is really doing for fear of their employment?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for tabling. I've just seen the memo for the first time. It talks about making sure that communication standards are followed. Mr. Speaker, he's asking for an apology for a memo that I had never seen before, that no one on this side of that.
Order, please. Let's listen to the response. Recognize the Minister.
No one on this side of the House had ever seen before, Mr. Speaker. To say that frontline staff are under a microscope is just nonsense. Mr. Speaker, we encourage frontline staff to raise concerns that they may have. We put processes in place to allow that to occur. Mr. Speaker, we have a very good working relationship with frontline staff. Mr. Speaker, we've made healthcare a priority. All the nonsense aside, Mr. Speaker, far more resources in healthcare than there ever was under the NDP. Since 2007, Mr. Speaker, a 60% increase in funding in healthcare, Mr. Speaker, almost $6 billion, Mr. Speaker. It's a priority.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the reaction on the other side only goes to further underscore that they're well aware that this is exactly the process and the culture of secrecy throughout this government, that workers are afraid to tell their stories. They'll tell them to us, but they're afraid to tell them in the public because they are aware that there are ramifications from this government, that this government will seek retribution, Mr. Speaker. This SHA memo only further reveals and underlines that culture of secrecy. And it also goes further. You'll read to the end of the memo and you'll see it also gives advice on how to avoid FOIs, Mr. Speaker. From the memo, if you don't want to see it in the newspaper, then don't include it in the meeting minutes. Is ducking freedom of information really something that the Premier, who has yet to stand up on this question, I'll note, that he wants to stand behind? Mr. Speaker, does he agree that employees shouldn't record what's really happening in our hospitals because people might find out what's really happening in our hospitals?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Oh my gosh, Mr. Speaker, I don't know where to start. The member opposite is a doctor. He used to work in the healthcare. He used to work in the healthcare system. Mr. Speaker, was he scared of his job? Was he? Well, he looks a little astounded, Mr. Speaker, because of course he wasn't. Of course not. Mr. Speaker, this is just ridiculous. We've never seen this memo before. Obviously, staff are gonna send emails to each other. I will have senior management look at this, Mr. Speaker. This is no attempt by this government to muzzle any frontline worker. I can't make this any clear.
See if this works. Recognize the Minister. Finish up your response. Thanks.
Mr. Speaker, I can't make this any more clear. This is not an attempt to muzzle anyone in any way, shape, or form. We encourage people that have concerns. They can certainly raise them. Mr. Speaker, healthcare is a serious business in this province, Mr. Speaker. We have serious issues in different areas of healthcare, Mr. Speaker. We're focusing on that, not on this nonsense.
There's a member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This minister's clearly out to lunch. Let's bring him back down to reality. Hear, hear. If this government spent even half their time focusing on solutions instead of sweeping issues under the rug, we might have a functional health system. Of course, it's easy for this Premier or this minister to deflect, try and pass blame, but they've been in government for over a decade, and these failures in our health system are happening right now under their watch. To the minister, beyond hearkening back to the past, what is the plan to end hallway medicine and to fix our crumbling hospitals?
Good question. Here, here. Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, to her point about, as she called it, crumbling hospitals, Mr. Speaker, I'll follow up on some questions she asked yesterday, which of course she neglected. I spoke to senior officials at SHA this morning about it. Out of 84 work orders that were reported that the member opposite was talking about in the report, 49 of them have now been completed and closed, and 35 of them are being planned for completion. Mr. Speaker, Regina General, which she raised yesterday, Mr. Speaker, there's about 1,000 work orders a month goes into Regina General, into the maintenance folks. It's an ongoing cycle of work that gets done. They tell me roughly the same amount of work orders get completed. Not all of them can be completed, Mr. Speaker, in a timely manner, because you may have a case, for example, a flooring project that needs to be done in a unit. It has to be scheduled appropriately because you may have to shut down the unit for a period of time. So sometimes those take a while, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'll follow up on a subsequent question.
Recognize a member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. $3.3 billion is what's needed in terms of health infrastructure. That answer is not going to do from that minister. We know that this number has grown by over 50% in 4 years, so there is a tremendous amount of work that's needed, and that wasn't the question, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the health region is in the midst of an investigation into the emergency room overcapacity crisis that left a patient in the hallway for a week. We're also awaiting the results of the health region's investigations into the death of a patient in a Saskatoon emergency room who, according to frontline staff, died waiting too long for care. Now we see memos reinforcing corporate citizenship and warning about the risk of information getting to the press. Mr. Speaker, we need more transparency about the challenges in our health system, not less. Will the minister commit to releasing the findings of both reviews today, or will those be covered up as well because they challenge the government's narrative that everything is just fine?
Good question.
Recognize Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, there's so many things wrong with that question. The government's narrative isn't everything is just fine. I've said from day one we're extremely concerned about the issue with the emergency department wait times, Mr. Speaker. Senior officials in the SHA are taking action to attempt to rectify that. Mr. Speaker, I've spoken many times in this House over the last couple of weeks about the short-term plans that are being underway and more long-term action to alleviate the congestion in our emergency room wait times. Mr. Speaker, as far as the two reports that the member opposite spoke about, Mr. Speaker, with an eye, of course, to privacy, because there's some individual people involved in those, with an eye to that, we certainly are going to be as transparent as we possibly can.
I'll caution the member about using terms like covering things up. All right? Recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this memo does nothing less than advise physicians to stop asking for resources and to keep information unavailable to FOI requests. This should be a serious concern to this minister and this government. Again, to the minister, in the spirit of transparency, which is sorely lacking, will he commit today that the full findings of the hallway medicine and patient death reviews will be made public? And will he commit to calling for a coroner's inquest into the patient's death in Saskatoon?
Hear, hear.
Hear, hear. Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I've already answered the question on transparency. Mr. Speaker, we will have to keep in mind that there's privacy legislation in this province, Mr. Speaker, but beyond that, we will certainly make every attempt to be as transparent and forthcoming as possible. Mr. Speaker, as far as the coroner's inquest, I had an opportunity with the Justice Minister last week to meet with the coroner. The coroner tells me he's investigating that right now. He will decide at the appropriate time, once that investigation is complete, he will decide whether or not an inquest is needed.
Recognize a member for Regina Lakeview.
The Premier keeps pointing to one line in the 36-page Reimagine Education report saying that the system is not broken. Let me be clear, Mr. Speaker, the system is not broken is hardly an endorsement. But it's easy to understand why not broken is the best grade that this government can hope for on their record in education. To start, $400 less per student, and school divisions left with an $80 million shortfall. A broken promise to hire 400 educational assistants. When will this government stop hiding behind their talking points and admit that not broken simply is not good enough?
Hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I was on my feet yesterday answering questions in this very area, and I talked about the increase we've had in budget, the increase that we've had in the number of teachers, the number of FTEs, the number of special needs supports. But, Mr. Speaker, what I'd like to do is remind the members opposite a little bit about what's taken place on capital. March 2019, Regina Lakeview received Argyle Elementary School. March 2019, Regina Lakeview received École St. Pius. March 2014, Regina Lakeview had the opening of École Connaught. March 2014, Sacred Heart Community School opened in Regina Elphinstone Centre. October 2013, Plainsview Elementary School opened in Regina Rochdale. October 2013, St. Nicholas School opened in Regina Rochdale. October 2013.
Next question. Recognize the member for John Lakeview.
Speaker, and it's about what I've come to expect from that minister. Petty politics in the place of answers.
Hear, hear, hear. That's right.
Mr. Speaker, over the last 4 years, despite 10,456 additional kids in our K-12 system, supports in classrooms have been cut. Over the same period, we have seen, Mr. Speaker, 9% fewer psychologists, 8% fewer speech and language pathologists, 18% fewer occupational therapists, and 8% fewer English as an additional language teachers. The need is higher, but there's less help, Mr. Speaker. It's just plain wrong. Today, the SSBA wrapped up their fall assembly, and again, they passed a resolution calling for better supports and sufficient funding. When will the Sask Party listen to these concerns and finally start adequately funding public education in Saskatchewan?
Hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Second highest question pending in the agenda.
Mr. Speaker, it may be petty politics to us, but on this side of the House, it's over $2 billion in investment. Mr. Speaker, our government has invested over $10,900 per student, a 23% increase from 07-08. Speech-language pathologists up 41%, occupational therapists up 26%, psychologists up 25%, EAL teachers increased by 34%. Mr. Speaker, these are the plain numbers. The members opposite should understand and hear them. Enrollment has increased by 15%, while operating expenses have increased by 34%. Mr. Speaker, the legacy that was left behind was the NDP was 176 schools closed. An average of 1 school per month was being closed. During 01 and 07, they lost 400 teachers.
Recognize the member for John Lakeview.
Speaker, perhaps that minister would like to open up a copy of the Star Phoenix and look at some examples from his own hometown. In Saskatoon Public Schools alone, the number of students who need full-time EAs has grown 30% over the past 4 years. Wow. But the number of full-time EAs over that same period has grown only by 9%. There are so many needs that are not being taken care of, Mr. Speaker. There are so many teachers that are ready to help meet these needs, but are being held back simply by the lack of resources. So again, to the minister, will he stop saying that not broken as if it's an A+ and commit today to a mid-year assessment and adjustment to address the urgent shortfall in our classrooms?
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, we provide block funding to school divisions. We don't tell the school division, hire this person, don't hire that person. That's not how the democratic process works. Mr. Speaker, they asked about how many additional EAs were provided in the last year. Mr. Speaker, we provided an additional $30 million for that purpose. And, Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue to do that kind of thing, and we're not going to try and dictate to the school divisions how they allocate their resources. Mr. Speaker, we spent $2.125 for early learning intensive support pilot program, $4.285 for 14 early childhood intervention programs, $15.648 for Kids First regional and Kids First targeted programs, and I can go on and on and on, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the minister was right with the last portion of his statement, that's for sure. 3 weeks ago, I asked the Highways Minister why the government was lining up behind the bypass to block a local steel company from getting paid for work that they did on the bypass. In the rotunda, he said that the government didn't take a position. Well, Mr. Speaker, that's not what the court decision said. Quote, the government of Saskatchewan, as represented by the Ministry of Highways and Infrastructure, support RBDB's application. So why did the minister say one thing to reporters while his government lawyers were saying something else in court?
Recognize the Minister of Highways.
Mr. Speaker, the only interest the government has in this court case is to make sure to ensure there's a fair result, and of course to make sure that the law is properly interpreted, Mr. Speaker. There's no allegation made against the government. No relief is being claimed against the government, Mr. Speaker. This is another example of the members opposite just don't like this project, and they'll do anything to cast aspersions on it, Mr. Speaker. This is purely a dispute between a contractor and a subcontractor. And of course, the government has an advisor there and an observer there to make sure the laws are interpreted and any questions that might need to be answered on behalf of the government are answered.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
Speaker, the language in the court decision is very, very clear. This government supported the application of the bypass partners. The decision from the Court of Queen's Bench also found that the bypass partners were wrong and that the local company was right. The judge ruled that, quote, to accept the interpretation suggested by RBDB that the Builders Lien Act has no application to a multi-million-dollar highway project would be extremely unreasonable and inequitable and incompatible with the object of the legislative enactment. And now, Mr. Speaker, that decision is being appealed by the bypass partners. So this time, when the bypass is in court arguing that it shouldn't have to pay local companies for the work they do, will the Minister of Highways be siding with the French conglomerate or the local companies just trying to get paid?
Recognize the Minister of Highways.
Mr. Speaker, our only interest is to make sure that a fair outcome ensues. And Mr. Speaker, we cannot take a side with the contractor or the subcontractor, not knowing the details. We're not involved, Mr. Speaker. That's to the courts to decide. Mr. Speaker, I must admit, after listening to the members' scrum in the news, I think it was a week or two ago, I have a few questions on my own, so I wanted to get a judgment from Justice to just interpret some of what the member said in her scrum. And after listening to those comments to the media, we asked Justice again to analyze the assertions that she had pointed out, and they pointed out that virtually all of the points she made were incorrect. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm open to offering for the member opposite to sit down with Justice officials to maybe go through some of her comments.
Order, please. Finish your answers, Minister.
If the member across so wishes, Mr. Speaker, we're happy to facilitate a meeting between Justice officials and herself to go through some of her allegations and comments to point out her inaccuracies.
Hear, hear.
There's a member for Saskatoon, Newtown.
Mr. Speaker,
I bet he can't say a single one.
thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think what we're looking for from this government is some support for local companies and not siding with a large international conglomerate. That's all we're asking for, and we would like to hear this minister commit to that today. Will he commit?
Hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of Highways.
Mr. Speaker, support of local companies. Over 70% of the companies involved in this project were Saskatchewan local companies. 9,200 employees, Mr. Speaker, during the course of this construction were from local entities, Mr. Speaker. Huge job creation, a huge infrastructure project that serves, of course, the Regina area, Mr. Speaker, but it connects the Highway 1, our Trans-Canada Highway, through our main capital city for safe transportation, efficient transportation, Mr. Speaker, economic growth, safe transportation for our families, Mr. Speaker. I think many stories we've heard about this bypass, whether the fire chief of White City or the mother who had lost a son along that stretch of highway east of the city in 2013, Mr. Speaker, and the stories that ensue since the opening of the bypass, I think they speak for themselves.
Hear, hear.
Recognize a member for John Elphinstone Centre.
Mr. Speaker, earlier today we found out that Creative Saskatchewan has fired their second CEO inside of 4 years, Mr. Speaker. To the minister responsible, what the heck is going on at Creative Saskatchewan?
Yeah. Recognize the Minister of Parks, Culture and Sport.
Mr. Speaker, there's lots of good things happening at Creative Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, supporting the creative industries for many years now in the province of Saskatchewan. We've seen some good results from that granting entity, Mr. Speaker. There's a long list if there's any other questions after this, Mr. Speaker. In terms of the current CEO, the Board of Directors decided to make a change at this time. It was not a political decision. Creative Saskatchewan will continue to operate as normal, Mr. Speaker. There's two people that have been there for a long time that will co-coordinate things in the interim while a new CEO is being looked for, Mr. Speaker. So operations will continue.
Recognize a member for John Elphinstone Centre.
Mr. Speaker, it's more than passing strange. You know, here's the government saying that all the great things are happening at Creative Saskatchewan. So much so, in fact, that they've fired their second CEO in 4 years, Mr. Speaker. And when that individual was asked for comment, Mr. Speaker, he stated that he had been, quote, instructed by the board not to speak to the media about his dismissal and declined to comment, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, cast your mind back to earlier in question period. This is a government that likes to throw around gag orders like frisbees, apparently, Mr. Speaker. So again, to the minister responsible, what the heck is going on at Creative Saskatchewan?
Recognize the Minister of Parks, Culture and Sport.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said in my first question, there's a lot of good things going in the arts and culture sector in this province. We supported nearly $20 million for the Arts Board, Creative Saskatchewan, SAS Culture through the Lotteries Trust Fund, Mr. Speaker, $23 million since its inception to Creative Saskatchewan. 1,200 grant recipients, Mr. Speaker, in all different areas of the creative industries, Mr. Speaker, who tell Saskatchewan stories. Mr. Speaker, there's a lot of good things going on to the member office.
Ministerial statements. Why is the member on her feet?
I'd like to raise a point of order, Mr. Speaker.
What's your point of order?
Speaker, pursuant to Rule 20 sub 3, in the question period section of the rules, the responses shall be relevant to the question. Mr. Speaker, when the Minister of Justice was replying to questions about education, he did not comply with this rule.
Recognize Deputy House Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm a little disturbed by the point of order. I don't understand it. I was listening very carefully exactly.
It's unfounded. It's just silly.
Order, please. Recognize the Deputy Government House Leader.
Listening very carefully when the Minister of Justice was answering questions on behalf of the Minister of Education. He did reference education several times, going through a very long list of exactly what we've done within the education. I would think that the point of order is not in good interest.
I was listening as well, and that's why the Minister was cut off early. So I consider the matter closed. Recognize the Minister of Advanced Education.
Mr. Speaker, I ask for a leave for an introduction.
Minister's asked leave for an introduction. Is leave granted? Recognize the Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I see in your Speaker's gallery today that the Mayor of Regina, Mayor Michael Fougere, is with us. Mr. Speaker, the Mayor has had a long list of developments in the City of Regina under his leadership. Certainly recently the NHL Heritage Classic, bringing Uber to our city, the upcoming Grey Cup, and of course the champion of the single largest infrastructure investment in the history of this province. Having served for a long time in southeast Regina, he knows the problems there very well, and I'd ask all members to join me in welcoming him to his Legislative Assembly.
Recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you, it's a pleasure to join with the Minister opposite to welcome His Worship, the Mayor of Regina, to his Assembly. It's a pleasure to have him here today, and certainly on behalf of the official opposition, we thank him for his service, not just to Regina, but to the province as a whole. Certainly he's dedicated to the community, and projects or events like the Heritage Classic and the Prairie Classic were just amazing, and it was a pleasure to be out there and partake in that activity. I think as well of the Grey Cup that's coming next year, and I know he was there at the stadium this weekend as the collective silence occurred as that ball hit the upright, but a big fan of the Riders, and I know we're all pulling for them to be in the Grey Cup next year. And seated right in front of him is Sean Weimer, who's with Run Regina, who's involved as well in the I Love Regina Run that's in partnership with the Mayor's office. So I was just suggesting the Mayor's Run that comes up, I Love Regina Run. It's a great run. They work.
Yeah. Member, yeah, you introduced that person already, member. No connection, it's done. No. No, we're done. But thank you. I'd also like to take the time to recognize the Mayor as well. Welcome, Your Worship. It's a little different than what you're used to, but welcome. Ministerial statements. Introduction of bills.
Item number 1, Honourable Ms. Carr.
As the Minister of Government Relations.
Mr. Speaker, I move Bill number 194, the Miscellaneous Municipal Statutes Amendment Act 2019, be now introduced and read the first time.
Moved by the Minister that Bill number 194 be now introduced and read the first time. It's a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall this bill be read a second time? Recognize the Minister.
Next sitting of the Assembly.
Next sitting. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Orders of the day.
Government orders, second readings. Item number 1, Bill number 191, the Business Corporations Amendment Act 2019. Honourable Mr. Morgan.
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to move second reading of the Business Corporations Amendment Act 2019. At the December 2017 Finance Ministers meeting, Canadian finance ministers reached an agreement on 6 strategies to strengthen beneficial ownership transparency. These strategies included an agreement in principle to pursue legislative amendments in each jurisdiction to require corporations to hold records on beneficial owners. Mr. Speaker, this proposed bill will implement these changes in accordance with the agreement. The draft language is based on amendments to the Canada Business Corporations Act that came into force on June 13th earlier this year. It is anticipated that other jurisdictions will also adopt these provisions in the near future. Mr. Speaker, this bill follows Saskatchewan's commitment to strengthen beneficial ownership transparency, and the proposed changes will serve as a tool to help address money laundering. With that, Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to move second reading of the Business Corporations Amendment Act 2019.
Minister has moved second reading. Is the Assembly ready for the question? Recognize the member for Athabasca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Again, I'm pleased to stand on behalf of the official opposition today to give the initial comments as it relates to the changes under Bill, or suggested under Bill 191, the Business Corporations Amendment Act, Mr. Speaker. And primarily, as I've indicated time and time again, what typically happens in the Assembly is the government unveils their legislative agenda or their new laws that they wish to process through the Legislative Assembly. And what they typically do is present these laws in the fall. We have the rest of the remaining winter months to assess the laws and reach out to stakeholders. And then upon the resumption of the spring sitting in March, we do a final discussion and debate on all these bills. And then, of course, they are passed by motion and by way of votes on many occasions. And then, obviously, the government then determines a timetable in which they would simply enact the law and declare the law. And, Mr. Speaker, that process is called proclamation of these laws, and that usually typically happens at the end of each spring sitting. So it's important to know the scheduling and the process attached to all these bills. But on this particular bill, 191, the Business Corporations Amendment Act 2019, as the Minister has shared different notes with different organizations, what this bill really does, it talks about the provision on individual with significant control, ISE, over a corporation to reflect the new language in the new section under the Business Corporations Act. It sets out the rules for determining an individual with significant control. They must have a significant number of shares, 25%. It sets out the rules of for 2 or more individuals with joint rights to be considered the individual with significant control over a corporation, requires corporations to update the corporate records by maintaining a register of the individuals of significant control, requires a corporation to update its registry within 15 days of becoming aware of new information affecting the registry or the register. And, Mr. Speaker, it also creates a penalty of $5,000 for failure. to update the register, and it exempts some corporations from the requirements for maintaining a register and allows the director of corporation to require a corporation to disclose information about individuals with significant control, and it also allows the shareholders and creditors of a corporation to access the register of the individuals with significant control. Now, obviously, Mr. Speaker, this is meant to provide a bit more insight as to how corporations and individuals with significant control that operate within these corporations, the relationship, how they must register, and how different organizations and people, in particular shareholders and creditors, may be able to access that information. So obviously there's a number of changes here as it relates to the business corporation's activity of the province of Saskatchewan. This is really good information for people to shift through and to also try and assess as to how it's impacting their particular business, their investment, their participation in any corporation in the province of Saskatchewan. So it does have a lot of good information and points that people ought to pay attention to. So it's important, Mr. Speaker, that we, again, look over the legislation, each and every line. That is our role as the official opposition within the Assembly, and we will afford the same process to this particular bill. And as I've pointed out time and time again, there are people within our caucus that are much more learned than I, that are able to give a greater description of what's happening within this particular bill, and we certainly await their outreach to different organizations and people that are affected by this bill, and then from there they'll certainly let their positions be known upon those consultations with all the stakeholders affected by this legislation. So on that note, Mr. Speaker, I move that we adjourn debate on Bill 191, the Business Corporations Amendment Act 2019. I so move.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second readings, item number 2. Bill number 192, the Legal Professions Law Foundation Amendment Act 2019. Honourable Mr. Morgan.
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to move second reading of the Legal Profession Law Foundation Amendment Act 2019. This legislation amends the Legal Profession Act 1990 to improve the governance and administrative provisions of the Law Foundation of Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, the Law Foundation supports and promotes innovative programs and initiatives promoting accessible justice in Saskatchewan. Under the Act, interest that is earned on the mixed trust accounts of lawyers in the province must be paid to the Law Foundation to establish and maintain a fund for the legal education, legal research, legal aid, law libraries, and law reform. Since 1973, the Foundation has distributed over $70 million for these purposes. Mr. Speaker, this bill will make changes to the governance provisions of the Foundation. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to move second reading of the Legal Profession Law Foundation Amendment Act.
It has been moved that Bill number 192, Legal Professions Amendment Act, be now read a second time. Assembly ready for the question. Recognize the member for Athabasca.
Again, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As I take my place, as I have in many occasions, to do the initial description of what the bill is all about and to offer our initial comments. Mr. Speaker, the bill itself, 192, the Legal Profession Law Foundation Amendment Act, much of it's the gist of the actual legislation itself. Really, it's just housekeeping in nature, but there are a few significant changes within the bill that I think merits a lot more discussion and certainly merits a lot more investigation, Mr. Speaker. Some of the changes to the bill itself, the changes basically include the very fundamental changes. It changes the name of the Law Foundation into the Law Foundation of Saskatchewan. And while we certainly view this as housekeeping in nature, we know that there are some significant issues attached to how and when a person should, or an organization should change its name, and certainly to incorporate the province of Saskatchewan. Even though it is seemingly simple to do, there are a lot of processes and steps that must be undertaken to be able to accommodate that. It adds a new definition of board to simplify references to the board of directors of the foundation throughout the Act. Obviously, Mr. Speaker, when you're dealing with a number of lawyers, there are certain things you have to do in certain fashions, and wording is always really, really important, Mr. Speaker. And again, I point out to I make reference to my earlier comment about the although it looks simple to change the name from Law Foundation to Law Foundation of Saskatchewan, there are a lot of things you have to take care of. And when you talk about the word board, there's just a lot of references and interpretation attached to that. So what's basically they're doing in that second provision of the Act is really looking at how they're able to add a new definition of board, as they reference the word board throughout the entire Act, make it much more simplified. It does make some housekeeping amendments to some sections. The one area that I think, Mr. Speaker, the two areas that we do have, or I do have some initial comments on, and would obviously need further investigation and warrant further study, Mr. Speaker, is it extends, changes the composition of the board to four persons appointed by the minister and 5 appointed by the benchers. Now, obviously, it's a 9-member board, Mr. Speaker, and it does change the composition of the board because some of the process requires the board to elect a chair and vice chairperson from among its members rather than having the chairperson be appointed by the benchers. And what the benchers are, Mr. Speaker, are lawyers that are selected and appointed by all lawyers across Saskatchewan. They obviously have a stake in these particular matters. So what happens is every lawyer in the province of Saskatchewan, just by way of voting, determine who their 5 benchers are to be representing their interests in their profession in the Law Foundation of Saskatchewan. And of course, 4 are appointed by the government, Mr. Speaker. So it's a 9-member board, 4 are appointed by government, 5 are appointed by lawyers throughout Saskatchewan, and basically it's a voting process where they select 5 of their members. But Mr. Speaker, what happens is the board should be, previously they elected their chairperson and vice chairperson from amongst its members, and the change there is that previously the chairperson was appointed by the benchers, which in this case would be all the lawyers that were elected to this particular Law Society Foundation board. So there are a few changes that are there. For whatever reason, we have to investigate how those changes, although minute in detail, Mr. Speaker, there could be a lot of ramifications to the process, a lot of ramifications to political interference into the Law Society or Law Foundation of Saskatchewan by the government. So it's really important that we try and make sure that we keep the judiciary function separate from the legislative function and from the political function as we operate the democracy called Saskatchewan government. And sometimes when you see the government trying to position themselves to have influence in some of these committees and some of these boards, it really does begin to, you obviously are very defensive and have many, many questions. So on that note, Mr. Speaker, we do want to study those particular aspects of the bill itself at greater length to see what the implications are. And as I've said time and time again, we have lawyers in our caucus that are very adept at trying to understand these things and participate in these debates with their background and knowledge. So it makes it much more easier when you have that kind of experience within our caucus. But however, they will certainly have further comments on this particular bill. Until such time, Mr. Speaker, I move that we adjourn debate on Bill 192, the Legal Profession Amendment Act 2019.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pledge assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second readings, item number 3. Bill number 193, the Statute Law Amendment Act 2019, number 2. Honourable Mr. Morgan.
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to move second reading of the Statute Law Amendment Act 2019, number 2. This bill will make housekeeping changes to numerous pieces of legislation in order to update and modernize their provisions. Mr. Speaker, the proposed changes will replace gendered and outdated language, such as references to workmen or foremen, with gender-neutral terms like workers and for persons. Reference to the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations will be uniformly updated to the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations. The proposed changes will also replace a number of references to department with ministry. Mr. Speaker, one of the purposes of these amendments is to standardize terms and phrases in legislation. Doing so will assist readers and those who undertake electronic searches to locate the provisions that they require. These changes will provide a benefit to everyone who relies on our legislation. Mr. Speaker, the proposed changes will also make a number of additional changes and updates to clarify and modernize the existing language of legislation. The changes are all housekeeping in nature and will not have a substantive impact on the provisions of the legislation being amended. With that, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to move second reading of the Statute Law Amendment Act 2019, number 2.
It's been moved that Bill number 193 be now read a second time. Assembly ready for the question? Recognize the member for Athabasca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Again, I'm pleased to stand in my place to provide initial comments as it pertains to Bill 193, the Statute Law Amendment Act 2019. And certainly, as the Minister has alluded to, Mr. Speaker, the basic provision of this bill is to make a bunch of housekeeping changes to a number of pieces of legislation in order to update and modernize their provisions. And some of the legislation that are being impacted by this particular bill, Mr. Speaker, is the Adult Guardianship and Co-Decision-Making Act, the Agricultural Administration Act, the Engineering and Geoscience Profession Act, the Expropriation Rehabilitative Projects Act, the Funeral and Cremation Services Act, the Health Information Protection Act, the Highways and Transportation Act, 1997, the Land Surveyors and Professional Surveyors Act, the Pharmacy and Pharmacy Disciplines Act, the Police Act 1990, the Saskatchewan Farm Security Act, the Saskatchewan Gaming Corporations Act, the Saskatchewan Telecommunications Act, and finally, Mr. Speaker, the Weed Control Act. So this bill, Statute Law Amendment Act 2019, while it's housekeeping in nature, affects all the different acts that I made reference to. So it's important to understand how the changes within this particular bill impact all the different acts that I've listed. And this is something that obviously we would follow up and follow through, and we would look through each of these acts to see how this particular bill changes the language or intent of those acts that I listed on this occasion. So I think it's important that we pay attention to these particular bills and we look at exactly what is being intended on each of those acts, and that's why part of the process of thoroughly assessing what acts and what bills are being brought forward to the government is a responsibility of the opposition, and certainly from our perspective, Mr. Speaker, we will do so, and we will do so vigorously and thoroughly, and we'll also reach out to all the different organizations out there that may have some concerns as it pertains to this particular act, and the outreach obviously goes both ways. We would outreach to them, and they'd certainly outreach to us as well to share information of value on any of these bills, in particular this bill that we're discussing today. So on that note, I move that we adjourn debate on Bill number 193, the Statute Amendment Act 2019.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates, item number 6. Resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 179, the Apiaries Amendment Act 2019. Ms. Beck.
As a member for Saskatoon Riversdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As always, it's my pleasure to wade into debate and discussion on the bill before us, Bill number 179, the Apiaries Amendment Act 2019. Just for folks who might be watching at home, what usually happens in the fall session, the government introduces legislation, and then between the fall and the spring, it's the opportunity for the public, impacted stakeholders, so people who are affected by the legislation and others, to take a look at the legislation and see if it is in fact meeting the needs of the intended impacts of the bill, and sometimes the minister's intended impacts. There's also unintended impacts or unintended consequences. And one of the best ways to avoid unintended consequences is to make sure you do thorough consultation with those who are affected by legislation or policy, Mr. Speaker. So it's always important to look to the minister's second reading speech to find out where a bill is coming from, who asked for it, and who was spoken to about it, Mr. Speaker. In the minister's second reading speech, he points out that there was consultation, that the changes proposed in this particular bill came after consultation with people in the apiary industry, so he says stakeholders and partners. I think one thing when we get to committee, I know our critic will want to know who those stakeholders and partners were, what did the consultation look like. Sometimes governments have a habit of doing consultation simply to say that they've consulted, so there'll be lots of questions about whether or not the consultation was meaningful, did it help inform the bill, or was it just superficial and the bill was going forward in its particular form or not, Mr. Speaker. The Minister argues in his comments that he believes this bill will strengthen the sector and improve the health of our province's bee colonies, but it is important to make sure that that is what people in the industry think as well, Mr. Speaker. The Minister in his second reading speech points out that some of these changes are coming because, for example, there were a few years ago the implementation of Saskatchewan's premise identification regulations, making it mandatory for all livestock producers in the province to register their livestock in the premises identification system, which also included honeybee keepers. So this was, in fact, the Minister points out, duplicating the beekeeper registry under the Apiaries Act 2005. He points out that this premises identification system has combined with the beekeeper registry to reduce administrative work and red tape. Another change, Mr. Speaker, in this particular act, it allows beekeepers to utilize, in the Minister's words, the time-saving technique of open feeding bees, or I've also heard this by people in the industry calling it rob feeding over a particular period of time. So I understand that there's mixed opinion by people in the industry, or at least a little bit of not 100% agreement on whether or not that's a good way to go, Mr. Speaker. So I know in committee that will be a discussion that's had, Mr. Speaker. Another part of this act, the amendments to this act, the Minister argues will better manage disease outbreaks. In this particular bill, the Apiaries Act 2019 will define American foul brood as a notifiable disease to the Chief Inspector, Mr. Speaker. I know very little about beekeeping and all the diseases that impact our industry here in Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker, but just a quick, so foul brood, from what I understand, is not a stress-induced disease or stress-related disease, and it can happen to the strongest to the weakest of colonies. In an apiary, Mr. Speaker, it is a fatal bacterial disease of the honeybee brood, and I understand one of the most serious diseases that can impact a colony, Mr. Speaker. So that seems like a reasonable change for sure. It also, Mr. Speaker, the Minister says this bill seeks to ensure regulatory compliance in a number of areas. There's a provision that will be put in place where beekeepers must remove abandoned equipment, and he points out that this type of equipment is a potential nesting site for feral or wild honeybees, which can be a disease concern for beekeepers because feral honeybees can carry diseases that then they pass on to managed colonies, Mr. Speaker. It increases the maximum fines for doing so from $10,000 to $25,000, so hopefully that's a good disincentive, Mr. Speaker. And I'm not sure if that number is right or not, but those are all questions that our critic will have in committee, and after much consultation with others in the industry, he'll be well equipped to ask those questions. So the Minister argues that these fines act as a deterrent. When they were established, they don't keep up because the beekeeper operation size has increased. Those previous fines of $10,000, it's reduced their impact by having larger fines. Anyway, or by having the existing fines, and the larger fines should serve as a deterrent. Anyway, Mr. Speaker, I know that I have colleagues who will also speak to this bill, and as I said, our critic will have some comments down the road here once we know a little bit more about the bill, and I've had the opportunity to chat with people who are impacted by this particular bill. But for the time being, Mr. Speaker, I would like to move adjournment of Bill number 179, the Apiaries Amendment Act 2019.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 7, resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 180, the Miscellaneous Statute Government Relations Transfer of Gas, Electrical and Plumbing Functions Amendment Act 2019. Ms. Sproul.
Recognize the member for Cumberland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To join in on Bill 180, the Miscellaneous Statutes, Government Relations Transfer of Gas, Electric and Plumbing Functions Amendment Act 2019. Initially, looking at this bill, what I got from it, and of course, I know there's going to be more work done on committee, and we'll find out. But what I can take this bill, it's taking gas, electric, plumbing, and it's putting into the licensing decision, transferring the responsibility from what I get from the bill to TSASC. Now, from the minister's comments, TSASC will look after it, and what they will be doing is for the public, whether it's a single point of contact for the public, tradesperson, industry, to have one area. Now, talking about that and turning over that responsibility for those areas to TSASC, the minister also makes comments that no substantial changes are being made to licensing, inspecting requirements, and process of codes. So it sounds like they're not making any substantial changes. I think it's just finding TSASC as a source where individuals, tradesperson, contractors will go to get leasing, making sure they're following codes. So what I can get from this is, it sounds like it's pretty straightforward. We're not, and I'm not going to say, our critic will have an opportunity to ask some questions of the minister and the officials in committee to find out exactly what this is. But from the minister's comments, it doesn't look like there are a lot of substantial changes, as she has said. So at that point, Mr. Speaker, we're prepared for myself to adjourn debate on Bill 180 at this time.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates item number 8. Resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 181, the Minerals Taxation Modernization Amendment Act 2019. Ms. Chartier.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to get up and speak on this bill, number 181, an act to amend the Mineral Taxation Act 1983. In fact, this act in many ways reflects the imagination of the folks over there. When I read this has put me pretty close to sleep. I'm not one of those people who have the mineral rights to land, and so when I was reading it was getting kind of tiring, and I almost fell asleep. And it was like, when I listened to those folks over here talk about their plan for Saskatchewan, except for maybe a little voodoo math and that kind of stuff, I'm not sure what this is all about, but we will get to the bottom of this. We will get to the bottom of this, and when the minister says that that there will be no tax increases for the people involved, I just was wondering whether she had her fingers crossed or not, because I think, like the potash people who thought that they were going to be all right in the last budget, all of a sudden had a big surprise when they had a tax increase. Everything was going to be fine until the budget came down. So maybe this is the case with this. This is a bit of a getting ready for budget, and we'll see if there's more there. And we know particularly that Minister of Finance, who really appreciates a good tax increase, Nothing like $1 billion in tax increases. And yet they kind of align themselves with no tax increases, but yet we are paying more than ever. And what is it, $800 more a year? $800 more a year. So I just have to say that when we talk about taxation, I have to just bear it a bit, because I know those folks over there get pretty high and mighty when they talk about taxation and no tax increases, but yet they can do the job-killing taxes like nobody's business. And we see it proved out in the stats that have come out, the job losses in the construction sector, and yet those folks, I don't know, maybe they were asleep at the wheel when those things came forward in caucus and didn't really get that. But so what I say, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Deputy Speaker, when I see this bill in front of me, I say, hey, this is from a pattern. We've seen this pattern before, and what does it really mean? And if I was one of those people who held mineral rights, I'd really want to know all about this, because I mean, for sure, it's like when you have a kid and you thought you wouldn't have to pay PST on children's clothing, and all of a sudden you are. There you are. Or if you were involved with the potash industry and you thought you wouldn't be paying any more, and then last budget, all of a sudden you are paying more. You are paying more. And yet these folks over there can say, we didn't increase taxes, but we know it's well over $1 billion a year. $1 billion a year that we've seen taxes go up. And Mr. Speaker, we see our schools crumbling and our healthcare facilities crumbling, and yet we see the letter like we did today, where we say, hey, let's make sure we communicate all on the same page. So, so I haven't got right into this bill because it just seems to me to remind me of the pattern of what this government is all about. You know, it lacks any imagination. It lacks any real commitment to the working people, the families of and the seniors of Saskatchewan, and yet we're dealing with this kind of detail. And so the minister goes into, and she gave quite a speech back on November 5th about it, and I have no reason to believe her. Why wouldn't I believe her? Why, you know, I would expect that she would be right on. I mean, but really, at the end of the day, is this the best that they can produce in terms of we're heading into an election, and this is the kind of legislation we're having to take a look at? And so, Mr. Speaker, I know that many people will want to get into this kind of legislation. We'll have good conversations in committee. But with that now, Mr. Speaker, I would move adjournment of Bill number 181. Thank you.
The member from Saskatoon Centre has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 180, the Mineral Taxation Modernization Amendment Act 2019. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates, item number 1. Resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 174, the Enforcement of Maintenance Orders Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Forbes.
I recognize the member from Regina Northeast.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Again, it's a privilege to participate in this debate. Always, Mr. Speaker. The problem, of course, of single parents not being able to collect child support payments continues to be an important problem in society, and thankfully, many families who've experienced breakup don't have that problem, and they're able to work through their difficulties on their own. But there are a number of families where the parent who is supposed to be paying child support just doesn't do it, and of course that's what this legislation is aimed at. And sadly, Mr. Speaker, I don't think this bill is going to do much to change that situation. Of course, it does add one important piece, which is the ability to demand banking information. That, of course, is important. In my background as a lawyer, Mr. Speaker, I didn't ever have to get involved in divorce law or collection of maintenance orders, but I did have for many years the experience or the opportunity to do a lot of enforcement of civil debts. And with that experience, Mr. Speaker, I can tell you that the laws simply are too cumbersome, too hard to enforce, and too expensive for most people who are owed money to get justice. One of the things in that area, Mr. Speaker, that would be an important reform would be improving the ability of people to work across jurisdictions. At this point in time, all that somebody who owes money has to do in many cases is just leave the province, and they automatically can really float a court order or a judgment that requires them to pay money for an extended period of time, and puts the person who is owed money, and in the cases of a single parent might be really struggling, puts them at quite a disadvantage. And so one of the important reforms to this whole area that would be needed would be interjurisdictional cooperation to make it much easier for to collect debts where people leave the jurisdiction. One of the other things, Mr. Speaker, that I observed in practice was sometimes just the whole justice system moves. Its advances don't keep pace with technology. And so I see in this bill we have a provision saying that you can serve documents electronically, but sadly it requires, there's still this provision in there that it requires the consent of the person being served. And you know, Mr. Speaker, it's been almost 3 decades since email has been a common medium for communicating between people. In the last decade, we've seen just the exponential growth of social media, and all of that is electronic communication. But this notion that people can spend they spend their whole days communicating with Snapchat and Instagram and Facebook, and this idea that you would need the person's consent to serve them that way, it just strikes me as a little too regressive. We're not quite catching up with the times, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, when I look at this bill and frankly the whole legislative agenda of the government this session, what I see is not a very ambitious agenda, Mr. Deputy Speaker. We've got lots of housekeeping amendments, lots of miscellaneous statutes, very technical, non-controversial housekeeping amendments, but not really much of an ambitious legislative agenda here. And what that screams, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is loud and clear from this government. What this screams is a message that Saskatchewan is fine just the way it is, and we don't need to do anything to fix it. And of course, that's what we hear from the front benches of the cabinet every day in question period, is that everything's fine. Look at how much we've done over the last 12 years. Everything's great. Nothing to see here. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, nothing could be further from the truth. When we look at our health care system, when we look at the emergency room wait times, the wait lists in our health care system, when we look at the absolutely deplorable state of our long-term care facilities and the care that people are getting, the people who can't afford private care. When we look at just a few days ago, we had it confirmed that Saskatchewan didn't even come close to meeting our greenhouse gas emissions target. When we look at the crowded and more complex classrooms in our province, we have incredible challenges in this province, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we do have the resources in this province to fix those problems. We have the resources, but it's not happening, and that speaks louder than ever that this government is just dropping the ball when it comes to managing the affairs and the resources of this province. People are in need, and this government keeps letting them down. We need to change course, Mr. Deputy Speaker. We need to change course and have a government that puts people first. That is the whole point of government, is to actually put people first. It's not just supposed to be there, paying salaries to cabinet ministers and maintaining bureaucracies. The whole idea is to help people who need help. And if we're not doing that, then we're failing. And, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it seems to me that the evidence is clear when we look across the province. There are tremendous numbers of people who need help, who are not getting it. And so the evidence couldn't be clearer than that this government is getting a failing grade on its one job. There's this saying right now, you had one job. And the government's one job is to help people who need help. And on that one job, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the government is failing. So with that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I think I will wrap up my comments. I'll move that we adjourn debate on this bill to another day.
The member from Regina Northeast has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 174, the Enforcement of Maintenance Orders Amendment Act 2019. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 2, resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 175, the Marriage Amendment Act 2019. Mr. McCall.
I recognize the member from Prince Albert Northcote.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, as always, it's a pleasure to join in with regards to bill debates, and today I'll be talking a little bit about Bill number 175, the Marriage Amendment Act. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, when I was reviewing the Minister's responses with regards to why this particular piece of legislation is being considered for amendment, it was indicated that this hasn't been updated for over 20 years. So that's important that we look at the changes and modernize this piece of legislation. He also indicated that the changes that will be made with regards to the amendments will take steps towards addressing predatory marriages, and I think there'll probably be a lot of discussion within committee on exactly what he was talking about with regards to predatory marriages. That's troubling, and we want to ensure that individuals are not put in a vulnerable position. Mr. Deputy Speaker, prior to being elected here, I worked with men who are domestically violent, and you could see how some women can potentially be in a dangerous situation and can be vulnerable in some of these situations. So it's an important job for our government to ensure that we have legislation available so that if individuals are in a vulnerable position, that they could look after their own safety and can reverse some of these decisions. Some of the information the minister also talked about was individuals with diminished capacity being targeted and being vulnerable when it comes to being put into a position of marriage, and we have an obligation to ensure individuals are not put in those positions as well. And so, but one thing that's really difficult, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and also working with a mental health background, is to determine what is valid consent, and if a person has the capacity to determine that. That's a very big challenge. And so I know with the changes in this legislation, there's going to be new provision to permit an application to be made before the Court of Queen's Bench to nullify a marriage where an interested person believes one of the parties to the marriage did not provide valid consent to enter into the contract of marriage. And in order to do that, I believe it's supposed to be examined by the court or a medical examination, which I think that's a good due diligence and ensuring that you have a someone who is trained to determine what consent is or capacity is to be making those decisions. So, because we definitely don't want to take anybody's rights away from them. I know there's some of the changes within this legislation will be to prohibit marriages of persons under 16 years old. This is following some federal legislation that also made these changes, and I was actually surprised, like many probably, that I didn't know that individuals who were under the age of 16 were able to be married. And so I think, again, this is a vulnerable population that we need to ensure that they're being protected and that there's legislation available to ensure that they don't do something that they might later regret. And even at the age of 16, I know I was not mature enough to make a decision in this capacity either, but we got to start somewhere, right, Mr. Deputy Speaker? So I know there'll be some discussion on what the reasons were for determining what age of consent was. We know 16-year-olds can drive, but they can't vote, they can't purchase cigarettes or alcohol, but if they could get married, that's a bit troubling as well, I believe. But so I'm sure there'll be some discussion about why that age was chosen. So other changes, there will be some changes to the Will Act, which, again, when we're making some of those changes, we got to really do our due diligence and ensure that the changes are going to be done in best interest. So, and will some of these changes to this legislation, will they have consequences with regards to the Will Act? And I think there needs to be some great deal of public consultation before these changes are implemented, and informing the public of changes and how they affect them. So that'll be important to do that as well, Mr. Deputy Speaker. There's also going to be a change that allows a marriage commissioner to charge a fee that's agreed upon both parties. So my understanding is that the fees that marriage commissioners need to charge is standardized, and so some concerns I have is if a marriage commissioner can determine what they want to charge, and oftentimes people who are wanting to get married, they got to pay what they got to pay, and if they're in a market where there's not a lot of marriage commissioners, maybe that'll be more expensive for those individuals. And if there's a market where there's many marriage commissioners, there might be a competitive market there. And so I don't understand what the purpose of changing that format was. It seemed like it was a standard practice. Maybe marriage commissioners have asked for it. I'm not sure, but I'm sure the critic will do their due diligence in getting that information forwarded. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I had the privilege this summer to be a marriage commissioner for my niece's wedding. She got married in Alberta, and in Alberta, MLAs are allowed to perform marriages. And so I did all the paperwork that was needed for that, and I bawled during the dress rehearsal, but on the actual wedding day, I was able to control my emotions and do that because she's my baby niece, and it was very special. And so I know I've had some chats with individuals in this assembly about, you know, potentially having that as being a rule within Saskatchewan and allowing us to have that opportunity as legislators. So, yeah, and it would be nice to be able to do that again for a family if they wanted that. So I have a big family, lots of nieces and nephews, so it would be a privilege, but not necessarily what they need to do, but to be an option. And I know in Alberta it was that you couldn't charge a fee, and obviously I wouldn't expect one, so it was just an honor to be there. So again, like when we amend pieces of legislation, there has been some updates on the language used within this piece of legislation, and a lot of housekeeping done. So that's important too, again, with a piece of legislation that hasn't been reviewed for over 20-some years. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this is a really important piece of legislation. So we really need to be careful when we review it and check to see if any of these changes will affect any other pieces of legislation, and we know that this requires our close attention. So I know the critic responsible for this portfolio will do her due diligence and checking with stakeholders and anyone who may be impacted by some of these changes. And we'll have lots of questions when this comes to committee, and I know there's other colleagues that would want to put their remarks on the record with regards to changes to this legislation. So with that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm going to adjourn debate on Bill number 175. Thank you.
The member from Prince Albert Northcote has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 175. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates, item number 3. Resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 176, the Judiciary Access to Digital Information Act. Ms. Sproul.
I recognize the member from Cumberland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To join in on Bill 170, Judiciary's Access to Digital Information Act. There's not a lot into this act from what I can see. I talked to one of my colleagues a little bit about it, and it's talked about the digital information. and ownership, I guess, of that information. And my understanding that I got from is, I guess maybe Facebook, different ones where it's digital information, maybe it could be pictures. And I was trying to look at it exactly, that's what it is. If it's changing the ownership, should somebody be deceased or somebody have power of attorney, who has the power or who owns certain digital information is my understanding. And I wasn't really sure of it, and I thought, just kind of asking a little bit, and the explanation I got, and hopefully in committee and with the minister, just to understand why this is coming forward. There must have been some reason something's happening, causing issues with this, and I'm not sure if when you look at digital technology and I guess Facebook, there's different ones that the kids use, all kinds of Instagram and stuff. So once you put a picture out on Facebook, you think maybe when it's your Facebook, you own it, and maybe you actually, the picture now you don't own, and it belongs to Facebook or that organization. So once you post it, so I'm curious to see at the end of the day where exactly this is coming from, who requested it, and like I said, Mr. Speaker, there must have been some reason why government's bringing it forward. I'm not sure the reason why. I don't know what exactly, and I'm curious myself now, and I kind of said, interesting to see what kind of information come out of the committee for it. Like all legislation, you know, some of it you come through, you have a good understanding, and some of it you're not sure who requested certain things, but it comes forward. We work on those. And I think about different legislation, and I think about myself as a private member bill that I put forward, 618, the suicide prevention strategy for Saskatchewan. I'm hoping, and like a bill like that, you know, would get government's attention, and we could work forward. And maybe at some point, government will say it's the right thing to do, and we're going to work together. Where I've said we've done that, but I just was showing you examples of certain pieces of act that acts that come into play and bills that government brings forward, gives us an opportunity to have comments about. I wish we could work on Bill 618, but at this point I'm making comments and finishing up my comments on 176, and at this point I'm prepared to adjourn debate on that, Mr. Speaker.
The member from Cumberland has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 176. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates, item number 4, resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 177, the Miscellaneous Statutes Electronic Register Amendment Act 2019. Ms. Sproul.
I recognize the member from Regina Rosemont.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to enter into brief debate with respect to Bill number 177, the Miscellaneous Statutes Electronic Register Amendment Act 2019. I understand this legislation is an aim to move towards modernization of professional organizations, occupational organizations in the province. I believe we have over 45 occupational and professional organizations in Saskatchewan who are regulated through legislation by having a criteria set out for their self-regulation. My understanding is that the change that's brought forward here, which would allow for an electronic register, has been called for by these respective organizations. I understand that this wouldn't be something that would be mandatory for all organizations, but would be something that would be their choice, and so this enables those organizations to communicate those lists that register electronically, and that seems to make sense. Certainly will be, this does impact many different acts and many different stakeholders, many different professional and occupational organizations. So we invite all those organizations to share their feedback and their input on this piece of legislation at this time. Certainly, if there's any concerns with respect to this bill or maybe even some unintended consequences of what's been brought forward, this is certainly the time for those concerns to be brought forward. We invite them as the official opposition. Certainly, it's important to communicate with government as well. All too often, we see the Sask Party government failing to consult those that are directly impacted by the changes that they're bringing forward. and there's a risk then in bringing forward legislation that has a host of unintended and cascading consequences. We hope that's not the case with this legislation here. I do understand that the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, the Independent Privacy Commissioner, has suggested that there's some a constructive amendment that can be made to this legislation. So certainly that's an important change to be considered, or an amendment to be considered as this legislation moves forward. And I would invite again all folks that are impacted by these changes to connect, to share their view and their input and how this impacts them. And, you know, at this point, certainly this is an important piece of legislation because it impacts so many professions and so many workers and professionals and occupations. So it's important that we get this right. Certainly, as the opposition, will be consulting on this front and aiming to make sure that if this bill needs to be changed or improved or amended, that we work to make that happen. At this point in time, though, with respect to Bill number 177, the Miscellaneous Statutes Electronic Register Amendment Act 2019, I'll adjourn debate.
The member from Regina Rosemont has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 177. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 5, resume debate on the second reading motion of Bill number 178, the Miscellaneous Statutes Repeal Act 2019. Ms. Mowat.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Centre.
Much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's always a pleasure to get up on this bill. It's an annual bill where these folks are cleaning out the file cabinets and they're looking at bills that are no longer relevant. And some of these bills go back apparently to 1919, some of them up to 91, but there's some real highlights. But I just have to say, the highlight of the annual review of obsolete public and private statutes was a couple of years ago when we took out the trash called Enterprise Saskatchewan. You know, the former premier was hardly out the door, and those guys are cleaning out the file cabinet and said, we've got to get our erasers out and erase that thing called Enterprise Saskatchewan. It's going to be gone. It's going to be gone. And here we are. Here we are today taking a look at their latest list of things that have got to be gone. And one I found very interesting is the Family and Community Service Act. And that goes back to December 1st, 1990. And if my memory serves me right...
That's a hot time in the old town.
Yeah, that was Grant Devine's time. Grant Devine's time. And I think the minister at the time was Gordon Dirks. And of course, whatever happened to Gordon Dirks, well, of course, he did move west, and he's still very active. I think he was active in the education systems in Calgary, I think.
I believe in Calgary.
In Calgary.
Yep.
And so I don't know if these folks, if they're going to put on social media tonight, and Gordon Dirks is going to see that they're attacking family and community services. I mean, this is what the headline is. Sask Party is against family and community services. How can that be? Gordon Dirks leaves the province, moves to Alberta.
Can't leave you alone for a decade.
These guys are all talking about people moving to Alberta. Well, he was one who moved to Alberta.
Yes,
and what did he leave us? This ACT, Family Community Services. I just want to take a moment to say, what is this all about? So, you know, what we're getting rid of here is he talks about the minister of the, means the member of the Executive Council to whom, for the time being the administration of this act is assigned. These are his powers, may do anything that the minister considers advisable to promote the growth and development of services and resources to strengthen families. Now, who could be against that? Who could be against that? Well, we're getting rid of that over this year. Foster the healthy development of children, or provide local services and support to families. Now, Mr. Speaker, I don't know what Gordon Dirks would be saying to these guys. Hey, it sounds like a keeper to me, but these guys, when they're out cleaning out the file cabinet, they want to get rid of some of these things. And even though Gordon Dirks, one of their all-stars over there with Grant Devine, and I don't know if there was a budget passed, so maybe that was a problem. Was there a budget passed that year?
There was not.
There was not, so maybe it died because there was no money. There was no money. I know shortly thereafter in the spring, there was a
pretty
visit.
wild.
Well, usually the visit goes to the Lieutenant Governor, but this time the Lieutenant Governor came here and said, hey, it's your time. It's done. It's done.
Get going.
So it's very interesting. Now I'm just going to stop and listen to this heckle here. What's...
The ding-dong over there.
Oh,
sorry.
All of a sudden, the crowing has stopped from the other side, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The crowing has stopped. I don't know what's going on. What is the issue over there? Now, I have to say another bill that I'm sad to see, another piece of legislation I'm sad to see go, is the Water Appeal Board Act. And that's one is quite a favorite of mine, you know, and I was once the minister responsible for the environment. It seems they've forgotten over there. They never remind me of that. They never bring that up among the different things. But it was one that I'm sad to see go, because that was one at the local level where we could have some control. And you know, water in rural Saskatchewan is very, very important. And I was surprised to see it hit the dustbin. The other one is Veterinary Services Act, and this is one that really reflects on rural Saskatchewan, making sure there's appropriate services in rural Saskatchewan for veterinarians. And maybe it was a little too technical, the time had come. It goes back to the, well, this one goes back to 89, 90, so that again would have been a divine era. It had actually started in 78, but then finally was the last amendment was 89. So in a lot of ways it makes, would have made some sense to revisit this. But Mr. Speaker, it is interesting when we look at these bills. Like I said, there was one here from 1948, the one for the Sisters of Notre Dame, 1919, and several others from the 70s. So these do run their course of time. But it is interesting when you take a look back and remember the time, and I have to say that it's always interesting, as I said, what they bring forward. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I would move adjournment of this bill. Thank you.
Hear, hear. The member from Saskatoon Centre has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 178, the Miscellaneous Statutes Repeal Act 2019. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Adjourn debates, item number 9. Resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 183, the Fisheries Saskatchewan Act 2019. Mr. Witherspoon.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I was very eager to get into this debate on Bill number 183, the Fisheries Saskatchewan Act. This bill adds some new definitions. It changes some definitions. It authorizes the minister to designate fishery officers and allows the appointment of advisory committees. There's some changes to the procedures for issuance and transfer of license, and regarding the amendment, suspension, and cancellation of licenses. When the minister was giving his second reading speech, he said that the opportunities for modernization in this act were determined by the Ministry of Environment in terms of language and clarity on the intent of the act. So we'll certainly be reviewing it with a fine-tooth comb, Mr. Speaker. The minister also mentioned that the ministry had engaged with a number of stakeholders. So he listed First Nations and Métis communities, the Fisheries Advisory Committee, and other stakeholders. We will make sure that we spend some time checking in with those folks to see if there's any implications of something that seems very innocent, like a definition, Mr. Deputy Speaker. We've seen this before where it's passed over as a housekeeping issue, but you know, the devil is in the details, Mr. Speaker. So we'll make sure that we have a solid look at this legislation to see whether there are implications and there are going to be any consequences as a result of this legislation. I'm not sure who the stakeholders were that were consulted, and what their thoughts were. We know that consultation doesn't necessarily mean that they were on board, Mr. Speaker, and I note that there's some particular focus here on invasive species, and the minister talks about increasing the authority to respond quickly and efficiently to prohibited and aquatic invasive species. Certainly an issue that I've had the opportunity to learn quite a bit about and have heard quite a bit about through my time in public accounts and also in attending the Penwar conference. I know that this is a significant cross-border issue that we need to protect Saskatchewan, and so it will be certainly if it's making it if the bill is making it more this work more effective, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that sounds like a good thing. But we'll have to make sure when we look into the definitions and check with the stakeholders, we'll be checking in with them to make sure there aren't any unintended consequences. I know the critic will have more to say in committee, and other of my colleagues will want to weigh in, but with that I will move to adjourn debate on this bill.
The member from Saskatoon Fairview has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 183, the Fisheries Saskatchewan Act 2019. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 10, resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 184, the Fisheries Saskatchewan Consequential Amendments Act 2019. Mr. Witherspoon.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's my pleasure to weigh in today on Bill number 184, the Fisheries Saskatchewan Consequential Amendments Act of 2019. We know that often when we change legislation, we need to make consequential amendments to other pieces of legislation to make sure everyone is marching to the same beat, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I was just about to call you Mr. Drummer, Mr. Speaker, but I didn't, so it doesn't count. We need to make sure that there are changes to these pieces of legislation as well. So that is what this Act endeavours to do. Again, the Minister indicates that these changes are housekeeping in nature. We'll be sure to have a look at that and to weigh in accordingly. Certainly I will encourage anyone who is following along on Bill number 184 to also be looking at what our comments are on Bill number 183 as they sort of fit together, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And with that, I will move to adjourn debate on this bill.
The member moved to adjourn debate on Bill 184. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 11, resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 187, the Administration of Estates Amendment Act 2019. Ms. Rancourt.
I recognize the member from Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Always good to see the light on, and away we go. Bill number 187, the Administration of Estates Amendment Act 2019, does a number of things, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It adds the definition of capacity to the list of defined terms in the previous Act. It changes the reference to official administrator to public guardian and trustee. It specifies that the public guardian and trustee may be granted letters of administration if no letters have been granted to another person, as set out, of course, in Section 13. And it specifies the reasons for removing an executor or administrator of a will, and repeals Part 8 altogether, Mr. Speaker, as respects the official administrator. Again, Mr. Speaker, this is interesting information, and again goes right to the heart of our legal system, and good things like property and administration thereof, and who's got the right. So, Mr. Speaker, it's something that's going to come in for considered investigation on the part of our justice critic. Of that, I can be certain, and I want to rest assured yourself of that, Mr. Deputy Speaker. In case you're getting worried that may not be the case, that will be the case. And as well, There's some great supplementary inquiry to be conducted by a member from Regina Northeast, the member from Saskatoon, Montana. We're getting some of, I don't know if all-star is the way to put it, or, Anyway, I'll not get into this Mugs game of picking favorites, Mr. Speaker, but anyway, suffice it to say, this will have consideration, if I might say that, without getting in trouble with the table. But, Mr. Speaker, I know that there's a broader work of consultation with the community to be done on this particular piece of legislation. As was pointed out by my colleague from Saskatoon Centre, quite ably and quite forcefully, Mr. Speaker, sometimes all is not as it seems to be. And something that one year is the North Star of the government, the Cadillac of government enterprise, a few short years later, it's on the trash. So, if those kind of things can go on, Mr. Speaker, we're going to take our time with this one. We're going to get it done right. We're going to make sure that that consultation is done and that Her Majesty's loyal opposition will do the work of scrutiny that has been entrusted to us by the people of Saskatchewan. So with that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'd move to adjourn debate on Bill number 187, the Administration of Estates Amendment Act 2019.
The member from Regina Elphinstone Centre has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 187. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 12, resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 188, the Public Guardians and Trustees Amendment Act 2019. Ms. Mowat.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Riversdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to enter the debate on Bill number 188, the Public Guardian and Trustee Amendment Act 2019. This bill, Mr. Speaker, actually builds a little bit on the previous bill to which my colleague spoke, the Administration of Estates Amendment Act 2019. There's some connection here, Mr. Speaker.
I'm sorry, I had to.
So this particular bill, Bill 188, amends the Public Guardian and Trustee Act. And I will talk about a little in one moment here how this ties into the previous bill, Mr. Speaker. But it's always good to look to the minister's second reading speech to see where the minister is coming from, and then at this point, between now and the spring, we have an opportunity to find out if that is if there's a broader perspective or if there's some possible downsides of legislation, Mr. Speaker. But according to the minister's second reading speech, the minister says that it was in fact these recommendations in this legislation. The amendments were recommended by the Office of the Public Guardian and Trustee. So undoubtedly, as my colleague had said, our critic of justice will do due diligence in checking in on some of that, Mr. Speaker. But one of the amendments so this bill, coupled with the amendments in the Administration of Estates Act, will move the official administrator from the Administration of Estates Act to the Public Guardian and Trustee Act. So the official administrator, from my understanding, is basically an administrator of last, or the administrator of last resort, can act as an administrator of an estate where there is no next of kin or the next of kin are unable to act. So the reasoning for this is because the official administrator provisions only apply to the public guardian and trustee, and so all these provisions, instead of being in a couple different acts, will now just be in the Public Guardian and Trustee Act. Seems a very reasonable thing to do, Mr. Speaker. These amendments also update the term official administrator and replace it with public guardian and trustee, as the public guardian and trustee has been the official administrator since 1992. So those terms are one and the same, Mr. Speaker. The minister, in his second reading comments, points out that these amendments also update unclaimed assets provisions to permit real property such as mine and mineral rights to transfer to the Crown if unclaimed after 6 years. It's interesting, in the second reading speech, I've never given this much thought, but apparently air locator, you think about in this day and age of genealogy and genetic testing and how we're all finding long-lost relatives and connecting with relatives we may or may not have known we had. Apparently, this particular provision, there's some amendments in here around air locator companies that in some places have been taking advantage of prospective beneficiaries. So just a quick search, I didn't know there was such a thing as air locator companies, Mr. Speaker, and you just do a quick Google search and they will find your heirs for a fee, Mr. Speaker. So apparently this has been an issue in other places, and places like Ontario and BC have introduced provisions to address the challenges around air locators taking advantage of heirs, Mr. Speaker, with fees and those kinds of things. So there's been provisions in this bill to oversee the interaction between these particular companies and beneficiaries in Saskatchewan. Another amendment, some other amendments, they permit the public guardian and trustee to bring a dependence relief application on behalf of a minor dependent adult, dependent adults. They also grant the public guardian and trustee the discretion not to act on circumstances where there is another suitable individual. And the minister points out, thirdly, they authorize the public guardian and trustee to renew a suspension freezing assets for an additional 30 days. So these amendments seem reasonable at first blush, Mr. Speaker, but our justice critic will reach out to appropriate people, and it's actually also incumbent on people who may know a little bit about this field to also connect if they can feel free to connect with the opposition and or government to make sure that this bill is meeting the needs of people who need the services of the public guardian and trustee, Mr. Speaker. And there will be additional comments over the course of the next month while we're here in the legislature and in the spring, and undoubtedly there will be many questions in committee. But with that, I would like to move to adjourn debate on Bill number 188, the Public Guardian and Trustee Amendment Act 2019. Thank you.
The member from Saskatoon Riversdale has moved to adjourn debate on Bill 188. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 13. Resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 189, the Coroners Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Belanger.
I recognize the member from Regina Northeast.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. This is, unlike many of the other bills that we're debating here today, this one is actually implementing, in part at least, a significant review that former Saskatoon Police Chief Clive Wayhill did on the Office of the Coroner in Saskatchewan. And so this is actually a very important piece of legislation. Now, and the overall process of the coroner investigating deaths in Saskatchewan is obviously an important role that they play. There's a number of recommendations that former Police Chief Wayhill made, 44 of them actually, and so it's important that we look at some of those. Before I get into that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I did notice as I was scanning through a bunch of the literature on that review that he conducted, was that review, which was extensive. He generated a 104-page report with 44 recommendations. He talked to a lot of people, put a lot of time and energy into that. There was a lot of work put into that. And that cost the province $102,000. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, from what I can see, it looks like the province got good value for those dollars. But Mr. Deputy Speaker, I must confess that I saw a headline a few days ago, where the province is spending money that I have to say I was kind of outraged that we'd be using our public dollars to hire former Prime Minister Stephen Harper at more than twice the cost that we're getting for this. $240,000 is what we're paying Stephen Harper's consulting firm to do his work, and that is not money that we are getting good value for, Mr. Deputy Speaker. So just it's helpful to keep these things in perspective. Now, I want to get into the details of this bill, Mr. Deputy Speaker. This bill does a number of things, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It authorizes the appointment of a deputy chief coroner. It it gives the chief coroner the authority to appoint regional supervising coroners and officers and employees under them. It gives the chief coroner the discretion to disqualify a coroner from conducting an inquest or investigation. Gives coroners the ability to investigate a death if a body has been removed from the province or if a death occurred outside of the province. It expands the investigative powers of the coroner to reopen investigation. It authorizes a third party to request a review of a coroner's decision to not hold an inquest. That's a very important provision, Mr. Deputy Speaker, because what the overall purpose of the coroner is to maintain public confidence in that investigations into deaths that happened in custody or in suspicious circumstances, that those are investigated. The bill also authorizes the chief coroner to appoint a lawyer for an inquest, and it authorizes the coroner at an inquest to make recommendations at the conclusion of an inquest. Now, that is also an important change, Mr. Deputy Speaker, because formerly it was only the jury at an inquest that could make recommendations, and so giving the presiding coroner the ability to make recommendations is an important step that was recommended by Clive Wayhill. Mr. Deputy Speaker, there are a number of questions that I have about the bill and coming out of Mr. Wayhill's report. For instance, one of the I guess themes of his report was that the coroner's office needs more resources. They need the ability to hire people to get results done, and that's not something you can fix by legislation. That's something you have to fix with money. And so one of my questions is what's the government actually going to do to make sure that that some of these recommendations that were recommended by Mr. Wayhill are actually implemented and followed through on? One of the things you may or may not be aware of is that when juries have made recommendations in the past coming out of an inquest, it's always about what can we do to prevent this situation from occurring again. So they make recommendations. Unfortunately, Mr. Deputy Speaker, a lot of times those recommendations nothing really happens with them. So one of the things that we think would be important, and I believe this was recommended by some of the key people in the province who have been involved in inquests and the coroner's office, what measures are actually going to be put in place to make sure that recommendations flowing from an inquest are actually followed up on, that they're actually put into place. Because how can we actually prevent these deaths from happening if we're not going to follow the recommendations and advice from the people who looked into that situation? Another theme that was loud and clear from Mr. Wayhill's review and report was that delays in toxicology analysis were really quite a problem. And if I recall correctly, what Mr. Wayhill said is he'd like to see the vast majority of toxicology results available within 90 days of being submitted, to make sure that in the vast majority of cases that these are not holding up police investigations, they're not holding up other decisions, they're not extending the family's grieving period. So that was an important recommendation, and we'd like to see what's actually being done to make sure that those toxicology results are being done on a timely basis. There's a number of other recommendations that Mr. Wayhill had. He had a recommendation in number 9. It was create an inquest review committee to decide if an inquest needs to be held, and that the chief coroner would provide the committee with a recommendation, after which the committee would have the full authority to make a final decision. So what is the plan to actually implement that recommendation? Another recommendation that Mr. Wayhill had was to create a formal child death review committee, which is similar to what other provinces have. And so we'd like to know, what is the plan to implement that recommendation? I believe he called for the addition of a forensic toxicology laboratory and to actually make sure that that the results that the coroners are getting actually matches the science and is backed up with scientific credentials. Coming out of the Humboldt bus crash, one of the recommendations was that there be a plan to deal with mass casualties. And so we'd like to know what is the plan to actually make sure that that recommendation is going to be implemented. Another important recommendation coming out of his report was the 40th recommendation of his report, which was to create an advocate position within the Office of the Chief Coroner to assist citizens and their families with their concerns related to coroners' investigations and decisions. Over and over again, we see that the families that are impacted and involved with coroners' decisions, many of them are coming from a low socioeconomic position, and they're not equipped to deal with the technical and the legal jargon and the complex processes. They need help. So that role of creating an advocate would actually be a very important change. And we'd like to know, what is the plan to actually implement that recommendation? And then finally, Mr. Deputy Speaker, there were some recommendations, including that coroners and the people involved in inquests and coroners' office get some training and education so that they're more culturally aware of the culture and rituals of our Indigenous peoples and also new Canadians, so that they're being sensitive to people who are already, they've already experienced the loss and the trauma of losing a loved one, so that grieving and that loss is not made worse by dealing with somebody who's insensitive in the coroner and inquest process. And then, of course, we had a very large, monumental process that took place in our country, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and there was a number of calls to action that came out of that. And we'd like to see one of Mr. Wayhill's recommendations was that report be reviewed, and that where it's applicable to inquests and the coroner's process, that those calls to action be implemented. And so we'd like to know, has that review actually happened? Is somebody actually looking at, where is the interplay between the calls to action and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report, between that and the coroner's office? Is somebody doing that review, and are they making sure that those calls to action are actually going to be implemented? Because that is a very important part of the healing and reconciliation work that needs to happen not only in our country but in our province. Mr. Speaker, with that I'm going to wrap up my comments, and I move that we adjourn debate on this bill.
The member from Regina Northeast has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 189. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates, item number 14. Resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 190, the Expropriation Procedure Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Belanger.
I recognize the member from Regina Lakeview.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and it is my pleasure late this afternoon to rise and enter into debate on Bill number 190, the Expropriation Procedure Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Deputy Speaker, one of the things that I've been talking to a number of school groups and folks in the community, and they've been asking about the legislative agenda in in the Assembly right now. And, you know, there hasn't been a lot that has come forward at this point. People were, you know, there are a number of issues that people are concerned about in the community, and they're looking to see what business is on the order paper for this Assembly to address some of those concerns. Of course, I've been talking to a lot of people about education, and that's top of the list. People are looking for some measures, some legislation and assistance for those concerns. We've heard the member from Cumberland, you know, talk very eloquently about the need for legislation, for cooperation, for action on dealing with the suicide crisis in the province, and that's not something that we've seen yet, and I do hope that we see that forthcoming, because there certainly are issues such as that suicide crisis that need our attention, that really is the business of this Legislative Assembly, and we ought to be paying attention. I think the people of Saskatchewan are looking to us to provide leadership on those issues and to have impact in communities right around the province. But that's not something that we've seen. One of the things that I did see when, you know, looking at the order paper was the Expropriation Procedure Amendment Act, and thought maybe this was a bill that might address at least one of the issues that we have heard a lot of concern about in this province, and that is about how land was acquired, and the processes that surrounded the acquisition of land around the GTH and the bypass. And certainly that has been on the minds of many folks in the province, and with good reason. In fact, so much so, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we heard two candidates for leadership for the Sask Party point out their very strong concerns about how that was handled. And no fewer than two of them, I think specifically at least the member from Saskatoon Northwest and the member from Meadow Lake, at one point were calling on a judicial inquiry into those matters. And the concerns are varied, but very concerning. We saw, many members here will remember, the auditor was not only asked by one but two bodies to look into how land was acquired around the GTH. She noted in her report from 2016 a number of concerns and a number of risks around the appropriation of land, which I will get into. But none of them are addressed in this bill, Mr. Deputy Speaker. In fact, what this bill, I would say somewhat disappointingly, or very disappointingly, deals with is only the amount of interest paid to landowners. And I'm reading from Hansard from November the 18th, 2019, and the minister noted, under the current legislation, a judge may allow an interest rate of 6% per year on all or a portion of the compensation awarded by the court. This provision was established in an era of high interest rates. At the time, 6% was viewed as a modest alternative to the going rate. Today, 6% is significantly higher than the standard interest rates and may act as a deterrent for landowners to resolve claims. Well, there have been a number of deterrents to straightforward deals and fair compensation, I would say, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Maybe interest rates were one of them, but I think that it certainly isn't the issue that comes to mind when people think about the problems associated with land acquisition. And of course, we are also, I believe, in a process in this province anticipating and gathering land for the Saskatoon bypass. And again, one would hope that by now we would have learned some of the lessons, mistakes, I think it's fair to say mistakes that were made during the acquisition of land at the GTH and the bypass, and maybe would expect to see some legislation, some acknowledgement that mistakes were made and changes to be implemented, but that's not what we see here. This is, perhaps this is a good measure, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Certainly interest rates are decidedly lower than 6% right now, but I think that this certainly is a missed opportunity when we're looking at the Appropriation Procedure Amendment Act to address some other concerns that are very front of mind. I know I had opportunity, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to be out on the doorstep a number of times this summer, and it comes up every day on the doorstep, concerns about the GTH, concerns about the bypass, the amount of money that was spent, not as the talking points on the other side would indicate. People have no problem with improving safety of the highway. Of course, we need to improve the safety of the highway. Having, as many of us do, friends and family who reside particularly on the east side of the city, the need for improved safety was definitely there. But that does not forgive some of the very real concerns that exist aside from that safety issue. So I'm going to read from the auditor's report from 2016 some of the risks. Speaking about the importance of an effective process to acquire land, if I can get technology to work with me, Mr. Deputy Speaker. So some of the risks that the auditor noted: not acquiring land in a timely or systematic manner, resulting in increased costs to the taxpayer, and that's certainly something that we saw. We saw land flipping. We saw some landowners speculating on land and flipping it, making a very tidy profit. But inexplicably, in other instances, we saw nuns who had their land expropriated. And certainly we've heard a number of those concerns here in this Assembly. Another risk, not being viewed as fair and transparent, thereby adversely impacting the government's or agency's reputation, increasing costs due to the likelihood of appeals and litigation with landowners. Well, certainly we are there in spades, Mr. Deputy Speaker. We have a number of court cases that are currently before the court. Some have settled, but all stemming from a lack of transparency, a lack of confidence in that process, and those court cases are going on today. Another risk, as noted in the auditor's report, not giving landowners fair value for land required for public improvement or transportation projects. And finally, treating landowners inconsistently or in a manner, in an unfair manner. And that certainly is a perception that is there, and something that is being worked out by the courts. And there is a real change looking back. Land purchases for improvement and transportation projects for the Regina bypass, for example. We saw in the early days, 2015-16, the land acquired by expropriation was very high, but as we moved through that process, further back, Mr. Speaker, 2014-15, 2013-14, we saw the government paying in the millions to acquire land, and I think it is precisely that inconsistent treatment of landowners that causes concern. Of course, there was the issue of the just-in-time purchase, the SAS Power purchase of land at the GTH that has also been brought up as a concern here. All of that, Mr. Speaker, lends to the concerns around how land is acquired, what processes we are using, the transparency, the public confidence in those processes, none of that which is contained or remedied by the legislation that we see in front of us, which is too bad. And again, I'll harken back to the days when we had a couple of now ministers, then candidates for the SAS Party leadership, who were standing and giving press conferences talking about the understanding that mistakes were made at the GTH, wanting judicial inquiry, but that remedy is nowhere to be found in this legislation. And I think that is a missed opportunity. This is, again, an issue, and as I mentioned before, moving into the acquisition of land up in Saskatoon for their bypass. We have not only an opportunity but a responsibility to get this process right. It's something that we should be seeing, I think, in front of this Assembly now is improvements to that process. But instead we see, perhaps a necessary, I credit where it's due, a change to interest rates.
There seems to be a lot of private conversations. The member from Regina Lakeview has the floor, and I would appreciate hearing what she has to say. I recognize the member.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And I think I am getting towards the end of my remarks here, but again, just along the lines that there are very real issues with the how the expropriation process has happened in this province as of late, particularly that there is an opportunity and a need for that process to be improved and for public confidence to be increased. And I do see this as a missed opportunity to only be looking at the interest rates with this bill that's in front of us. I do hope that we have opportunity. I know the critic will continue to be talking to stakeholders. Hopefully we have some opportunity in committee to be asking the types of questions that need to be asked here of the minister, but I will leave that in the very capable hands of that critic. And for now, we'll move to adjourn debate on Bill 190.
The member from Regina Lakeview has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 190, the Expropriation Procurement Amendment Act 2019. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried. I recognize the Government Deputy House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I move that this House do now adjourn.
The Deputy House Leader has moved to that this House does now adjourn. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried. This House stands adjourned until tomorrow at 1:30 p.m.